And we start with the COP29 Summit taking place in Baku in Azerbaijan, where leaders of nations suffering climate disasters appealed for greater urgency in fighting global warming, while others defended fossil fuels and their right to exploit them. Now, more than 75 leaders are expected to speak over 2 days in Baku, but the heads of many top polluting nations are giving the crunch UN climate talks in Azerbaijan capital a miss. The conference comes at the end of what scientists say is almost certainly the hottest year on record, with warming driven mainly by burning coal, oil and gas. Let's listen into some leaders and what they had to say.
We need clear financial guarantees and significant investment. Large corporations must contribute their fair share to climate protection. All climate policy should be guided by careful consideration and common sense, not by ideology, alarmism or panic.
We will honour the commitment made by the previous government to provide £11.6 billion of climate finance between April 2021 and March 2026. But we must use public finance as a multiplier to unlock much more private investment and reform our international financial institutions.
We're basically using a model of the world in terms of donor base that dates back to the early 90s. The world has changed a lot. And frankly, the high-emitting countries are not the same today. Some are, but there are new ones that weren't more than 30 years ago. And many of these countries are contributing.
Developed countries need to increase climate ambition and action, take the lead in fulfilling emission reduction obligations, and move up to a timeline for carbon neutrality. Developing countries also need to do our best within our capabilities. The Chinese side will also meet its 2035 nationally determined contributions that are economy-wide and to cover all greenhouse gases in the drive to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060.
If we don't live in tune with sustainability in the next 10 years, we will all fall, and the first to suffer will be those, the middle class and the working classes, because they are the ones that work in the most threatened areas.
It's worth noting that today those who were so concerned about climate enhancement are absent at this conference and moreover sabotage it. And what else will happen after the presidential election in the United States? So the question is, how effective are our actions at such meetings? Once the president of France felt great about the Paris Agreement, and where is this president today? Is it really not relevant? And that's how effective we are. So there's nothing to be proud of.
We are in the midst of a climate crisis. We are in a season of superlatives. And the reality is that these extreme weather events that the world is facing daily suggest that humanity and the planet are hurtling towards catastrophe. The extreme weather requires from us a serious commitment at this COP.
COP29 must tear down the walls of climate finance. Developing countries must not leave Baku empty-handed. A deal is a must, and I'm confident it will be reached. We need a new finance goal that meets the moment.
And while all of this happens in Baku, in contrast, a Dutch court has accepted oil company Shell's appeal against a landmark climate ruling, dismissing the order for the oil and gas company to sharply reduce emissions. The original 2021 ruling had ordered Shell to cut its absolute carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels, including those caused by the use of its products. And well, to discuss more, we'll be joined by Joshua Wycliffe, who is the Chief of Operations at International Solar Alliance. He's joining us live from Baku in Azerbaijan.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You are in Baku, and we just heard the leaders, they talk about their goals. What is the mood on ground? What are the delegates saying? What are the NGOs gathering from these leaders?
So from what I have observed, I see quite a bit of sense of optimism in the people that come to the International Solar Alliance's hub, and when I've just walked around other hubs and pavilions that we have here, I kind of sense a mood of optimism and expectation. Well, expectation's good as long as it remains as expectations. It doesn't help. It has to be put into action. So at every possible venue, at every possible event, the International Solar Alliance is hammering it to say that, well, expectations need to turn into action and actionable items. So we are able to measure the actions and the outcomes of that. So generally, the last 2 days, there's been a sense of optimism among the NGOs, including the private sector and the other people whom I have interacted with.
Right. And you've served as a permanent secretary of Fiji's Ministry of Environment, and you know how funding works for climate actions. And it's really interesting that some nations here, they want to ask private companies for funding who really they can't control. How realistic are these goals?
Well, look, if you look at it positively, yes, because I mean, I'm speaking out of my experience, both in New Zealand and in Fiji and in Australia. So some of these least developed countries in small island development states are at the brink. They are so up to here on their sovereign debts. So it's impossible or near impossible to expect these governments to further invest into climate mitigating technologies and climate mitigating infrastructure. It's the private sector that can step in. However, organizations like the International Solar Alliance work with the governments to be able to look into the existing policies, the legislation, and also the frameworks on regulations to be able to tweak or change in such a way that private sector is able to, they facilitate private sector to investing into these projects. That's the way forward. You know, money is not endless. There's no bottomless pit, but money is there with the private sector, which can bring in. And it's important that the governments work together in coalition to be able to make the legislation and policies friendly for investment, private sector to enter into the space.
Right. Now,
that's basically how I look at it.
Absolutely. Of course, we can always look for a positive outcome of these meetings. Now, UN climate chief, he mentioned that one man who isn't there but is overshadowing the crucial talks. Of course, I'm sure it's referring to Donald Trump. What sense are you getting over the next U.S. president's actions? Now, we know that Belarusian president too mentioned there is no presence of these leaders. What do you gather from that?
So the response to this question would would depend on who you ask this question to. I mean, different people hold different kind of opinions and impressions about what's being spoken at. I can speak for my organization and, of course, some of those people that I've spoken to. Generally, the approach could be that we go ahead we do not stop or we do not delay the action that we have taken. We continue to work with countries across the globe, countries which believe and which are convinced that there is climate change and it's got evidence backed up, science-based evidence backing it up. So the actions we do is based on the evidence and friendly countries. And of course, diplomacy plays a major role, as does the economy and commerce. So it will be very important to engage with the naysayers as well and not leave them alone, but being able to bring everybody on board and do all that we can to build a strong coalition with people who are willing, and at the same time, people who are outside, putting in efforts to being able to bring them on board. Not everything is possible overnight, but I'm a strong believer in persistence, and I think we could persist in it no matter who overshadows it.
Right. Now, the world's top banks pledged around $120 billion in climate aid for poor nations, but there are nations, which includes India, who have asked for trillions of dollars. Do you think the amount that the world banks have contributed or pledged, is that enough?
I would say no. Actually, the banks would need to do more in terms of making friendlier terms for green energy. I mean, the transition from fossil fuels to energy, and to put in climate change mitigation programs and infrastructure. The banks would need to be. It's not that they're doing charity. It is profitable. These businesses are profitable, so they need to look at it from an investment point of view, not from an aid point of view. So that would make it a lot more viable business-wise, it makes business sense to both sides. So the money they put in should also have a private sector twist to it, that what is the return on investment? And also one other key thing I'd like to mention is when they look at climate action infrastructure, they would need to ensure that everybody is brought on board and it's a just transition. For instance, if you're talking about energy transition, it's a just transition that no one is left behind. And if you look at it, 90% of the investment into this climate mitigation infrastructure has gone towards countries which already abound with investments. For instance, if you take Africa, 4 to 5% is all that Africa got into energy transition in the last year, 2023. And the reason is that there's a lot of perceived risks of return on investment. So what International Solar Alliance is doing is we've built a solar finance facility, which is on a blended finance mechanism, which takes care of developers' premiums that he has to pay on insurance, handles the first capital loss. So people who come in to invest, the banks who invest, would be assured that, you know, the guarantee is already there. They can boldly come and invest. The developers can invest. So the outcomes of the businesses, it's cut by half. When I say outcomes, I mean the fears and risks are cut into half. So people are able to invest a lot more freer. More and more financial institutions need to look at blended finance mechanisms to overcome these issues that we have. Because why we don't have too much money, or the money that we require, not into this infrastructure businesses, because of perceived risk, and that needs to be handled by financial institutions.
Right. And of course, with that, we always look for a positive outcome of this summit. And of course, you are someone who is going to be able to analyze, since you've worked on developing climatically and economically resilient community solutions. Of course, thank you so much for joining us on the show. That was Joshua Wycliffe, the Chief of Operations at International Solar Alliance, joining us live from Baku.